So, let's get on with it. Let me introduce to you our guest speaker, who is Michael Church, a Hadfield local who has lived near the West Street shops, he tells me, for nearly 52 years. Is that right, Michael? Right. So that's 1971 he moved in. Michael was born during the Second World War in England. He migrated to Australia from London with his family as a 10-year-old in 1951 and lived in Olinda in the Dandenongs. The family then moved briefly to Toorak in 1954, so from the wet Olinda and the ranges, the Dandenong ranges up to the dry of Toorak, and then settled in Albert Street, East Melbourne. After primary schools in West Ham and Olinda, Michael attended high schools in Upfield, Finley, which is in the Riverina, and the University High School. He graduated as a primary teacher at Toorak Teachers College and commenced his teaching career at Yarra Park Primary School in 1960. He was appointed head teacher at Lower Homebush also in 1960 and then taught at 3 one-teacher rural schools where he lived in the residence of the headmaster, or the only teacher. His last country school was at Greenvale in a 2-teacher school in Somerton Road. So it's a long time ago because Greenvale then wasn't all the sea of houses as it is now. It actually was a rural urban fringe, I think, Michael. He then taught at Moomba Park, Glenroy and Strathmore North primary schools, and then served for 10 years as the principal of the Hadfield Primary School, retiring from teaching in 1996. He had married in Avoca in 1963 and has got 2 daughters and 2 grown-up grandchildren. Michael commenced his uni studies while teaching at country schools. He completed an honours arts degree at Melbourne University, and then he went teaching in Edmonton, Canada, on an international teaching fellowship in 1977. He also completed a Bachelor of Arts and a Master of Educational Administration. Michael says he's a real committee person and for years served on tennis and golf club committees and was the president of the Hatfield High School Council. He has served as captain and president of the Northern Golf Course, where he has been a member for 37 years, was a councillor on the Victorian Golf Association for 10 years and is currently a member of the Golf Society of Australia. As well as his sporting interests, Michael likes watching live drama performances and opera. He has been a Rotarian since 1997 and was the Broadmeadows Rotary District Secretary in 2001. During his retirement in 1999, he started to work casually for the Victorian Electoral Commission and worked on a number of elections. He's also worked for the Australian Bureau of Census and Statistics and responsible for managing the census for the City of Moreland at one stage. Michael wrote the history of the first 30 years of Avoca Primary School, contributed to the reduction of the Jewel of the North, the history of the Northern Golf Club, and is currently researching the Essendon Golf Club before it became Northern Golf Club. For almost 20 years, he has written Broadmeadows Rotary's weekly newsletter. He also writes occasional stories for the golf club's website. Michael will speak tonight about Glenroy, the Toorak of the North, highlighting a selection of some of the personalities and places which have currently contributed to the Glenroy of today. So let's welcome Michael in the usual way.
Makes me sound pretty good when I hear all about myself. I'm not used to that. No one asked a question of the golf club some months ago. What's the origin of Sewell Reserve? I don't know whether that's been reported to you, but after we've had an hour of discussion about Sewell Reserve, Marilyn said, would you like to come and speak about Glenroy? Well, I've been working on it ever since. But I've got this. I've been asking people, talking to people, and I met just recently a lady called Judy Archer, who's a Glenroy resident from way back, who's writing a book on Glenroy, focusing on reminiscences from older residents. She said that in 50 minutes it could only be of a rather general nature, so don't expect anything too specific. Now, Marilyn wanted me to speak about the subdivisions, but I didn't feel there was enough material to talk about, there was enough material available. However, I come to accept there might be 4 periods of subdivision that could be defined as significant in Glenroy's history. The first one is Robert Hoddle's parishes, the land sales of the 1880s, the Try Again Tiverton estate in 1915-16, and the Housing Commission estate of the 1950s. I hope to address all of these as I try to tell a story about the development of Glenroy. In the meantime, I've read 3 of Stephen Carroll's 6 books about Glenroy. I've read Andrew Lemon's book over there, Broadmeadows, A Forgotten History. It devotes a few pages to Glenroy. Judith Falls, A Time to Till. I visited Broadmeadows Historical Society and have spoken with a 4th generation resident and of course visited Trove. I have an information overload. I hope it all makes sense to you. While Glenroy might have been around since 1940, it really didn't come to life until 110 years later in the 1950s. Now on to the story. Glenroy's a story of wealth, vision and ambition. The Toorak of the North. But then Tom Anderson says that part of Stratford claims to be the Toorak of the North. So where is the real Toorak of the North? Where is it? Essendon. It might be, because there's more mansions in Essendon than anywhere else on our side of town. Yeah. But it's not true. However, it was a dream that didn't come true. After a prosperous beginning and a vision that it could replicate the wealthy southeastern suburbs with mansions and estates, it all went pear-shaped. When depressions and world wars intervened, then the Housing Commission dumped cheap housing into the area. It seems it was never destined to realise the dream of its promoters. The Broadmeadows Observer, and there's a piece over there from the Broadmeadows Observer, it's a bit of yellow paper, said in 1987 that Glenroy was born in short-lived land boom period in the 1880s, faltered and struggled to pick up steam in the 1900s and finally blossomed in the 1950s. It said at the time that Glenroy benefited from a strong chamber of commerce and had one of the most comprehensive shopping centres in the northern suburbs. And it used to be. Now, Marilyn talked of me moving into Greenvale when it was a 2-teacher school. The only building, we could see the Daniels from where we were. The only building we could see from where we were was the Broadmeadows Town Hall. Between that was 5 miles of paddocks of thistles. A few homes on the west side of Nickleham Road, but not much else. Lionel Rose built a house there while we were there. Remember the boxer? Anyway, we travelled into Glenroy for our shopping centre, and it was a comprehensive shopping centre. All there was at Broadmeadows was a town hall and a station. That's all that was there. Now, Stephen Carroll, the author of 6 books that focus on Glenroy, including The Art of the Engine Driver, his first book, said in his article, that it's over there, another time, another place, in The Age in 2001, that he often experienced difficulty when seeking to explain to fellow students at university, especially from the other side of the Yarra, where Glenroy is. And I used to be a bit snobbish about that and tell people, oh, it's just north of Essendon. But it's actually closer to Broadmeadows. And actually at that time it was part of Broadmeadows. So nobody knew where it was. It hadn't made a noise, except to get into crime statistics from time to time. He said that taxi drivers refused to go there, drawing the line at Pascoe Vale. I have had a similar experience, not with taxis, but often staying north of Essendon, generally avoiding the Broadmeadows reference. Glenroy just isn't a go-to place. With Pascoe Vale on one side and Sydney Road on the other, it's more of a go-through place. If you're not from Glenroy, then it might be one of those places you can bypass. But if you're a local, Glenroy has almost everything you need. But it used to have more. Before the days of shopping centres when they amalgamated, we used to have a hardware store, home furnishings, and all that sort of stuff. You go to Northland or you go to somewhere else, and then you go to the annex part where all the other buildings are that have all of those things. It used to be all in Glenroy. Glenroy today has a busy shopping centre and many local shopping strips through the locality. Access to 2 railway lines and only minutes from freeways, north and south, schools, sporting clubs, recreation reserves and the municipality's best display of remnant river gulls at the golf club. A new library and a community hub was opened recently, and it's more easily accessible for me because it's my side of the railway line, and we've got a new station. Ours goes under, here you go to the top. So why would you want to know about Glenroy? The Glenroy that I know has had some rather mixed recommendations, comments and descriptions, and on one side it's reported as the 325th best suburb in Melbourne. And then I found in one reference there's only 321 suburbs. We're off the register. However, some more recent reports have been more generous in their ratings, even as high as 202 and most recently 184 were improved. Some say it's convenient, some report it could be cleaner, some report about its good parts, Hadfield and Glenroy West, and one said he regrets moving in. I guess it's not first on the list when you consider where you might choose to live, but it has many redeeming features and now appears to be attracting young couples and families due to its affordability. It is a more attractive place to live today. Glenroy has all the amenities and it's convenient to the city and beyond. It was seen as lower to middle class housing area, but with more townhouses and apartments, it's becoming more gentrified, and if you've got $1 million, you can buy a place here. So that's Glenroy. Now, how did it all begin? I'll just show you what is Glenroy today. Oh, sorry, I'm going to address these topics as I go through. The early days, the railway. If we didn't have a railway, we didn't have Glenroy. Land sales, the school, the golf club, aerodrome, the industries that were there, commission homes, and hope you come and visit us. The lady who's writing the story through reminiscences is focusing on Glenroy as a township, so she doesn't want to go past 1950. But it's now 2023 and you can't stop progress. So this is Glenroy today. We extend to Sydney Road, or to the railway line there, and to Mooney Ponds Creek on the left there. Used to include Oak Park, used to include Hadfield, all were called at one stage Glenroy. We all share the same postcode, 3046. But now Glenroy has become more Glenroy, and I live actually just off the edge, just here. I'm in Hadfield. Across the road, across Glenroy Road, is Glenroy. Now, as Marilyn has said, we're part of the Wurundjeri people's land, the broad Kulin Nation. The land is part of the Keeler Plains volcanic country, a basalt plain, and rocks everywhere, and I guess that's how we get Lerrybeck, supposedly. The first people who might have visited Glenroy would be Hume and Hovell. Andrew Lemon said in his book, Royal Meadows of Forgotten History, where he speculates that Hume and Hovell might have just bypassed Glenroy like everybody else does on their journey in 1925 that ended at Corio Bay. And he considers that he might have missed us again on his way back to Sydney. Everyone bypasses Glenroy. But then along came Robert Hovell. And Robert Hovell was sent down by Governor Burke to make sure that those people who moved into this place they were going to call Melbourne didn't muck it up. He sent Robert Hovell down to draw their plan better than Sydney's. So we've got this lovely grid pattern. But on his way home, he mapped the land as he walked through. And he came to, first of all, to the origin of Glenroy. Glenroy is a place in Inverness. It's Glenroy. It's a glen, which is a valley, but it's something special about it. It's got 3 parallel lines, and they're a geological feature. During the Ice Age, it melted a bit, and it left a moraine, which is the line along a glacier. Then it melted a bit more, left a line, the moraine along the sides, and then melted a bit more before it all melted away. And that's a significant geological feature of its 3 parallel roads, as they call them, and it's led to the naming of Glenroy in lots of places. And I've just been told that people here visited Glenroy in South Australia, but there are more. And that's another angle of Glenroy. No snow this time. Snow most of the time up in Scotland. It's fairly north in Venice. I've been there. Anyway, Robert Hovell, on his way back, I don't know how he did all this. Honestly, don't. I don't know how he's travelling. Cart or dray or something, but he's got to get through rivers because there's no bridges and a whole lot of this. But he marked out parishes, counties and parishes, which was the English way of defining land areas. So we're in the county of Burke. Where I live, I'm in the parish of Wurundjeri. Now, he divided, this is the first of the subdivisions, he divided it into 15 component parts. I forget what he called them. Anyway, he defined, there were areas, I forget the actual name he used, but there's 15 there. And then when he got back to Sydney, and he told Governor Burke what he'd done and what he found, they were put up for sale. And then the Europeans, well, people who'd come out, the speculators, this is the moment for the speculators. So the first speculators who bought the land in Wurundjeri were John Hughes and John Hosking. And they bid for that land, and they bid for 5 of the 15 component parts there. And they took 4 portions, this is the word he called, totaling 5,000 acres. I don't know how he measured them out. So what's an acre? We've forgotten, it's where hectares these days. Acres are lost. But that was the plan for the area of Wurundjeri, which is Glenroy. Now, Hughes and Hosking weren't going to be active landowners, so they rented the land to Scottish settlers, the Camerons, the Cameron family of Angus, Duncan, Donald and George, who came from near Inverness. They came from Glenroy. They brought the name with them. They named their farm the Glenroy Run. And the Glenroy Run, if you know Glenroy, you know where the RSL is, in Glenroy Road, that was about their place. They had 650 acres at that place. That's the Glenroy Run. They called it the Glenroy Run, and they called it that in 1840. And the name is stuck. So we've been around a long time. As I mentioned, the Glenroy was noted for its parallel roads. The Camerons leased the land for sheep grazing, so they were squatters. And they farmed as well into the 1850s. And the area gradually got the name Glenroy from them because they were the only people who actually gave a name to their property. And it's become the Glenroy Farm, the Glenroy Estate, so too the village, and later the suburb. It's not stated anywhere when the name became official or whether or not it was ever gazetted. But the Broadmeadows Observer, talking about their 100 years, they said 1887 as its starting date. And they celebrated 100 years with a special enclosure in the paper on October 28, 1987. So on their reckoning, Glenroy was 136, but it had started earlier than that. Now the Camerons had squatted on the land, but the land was bought by Donald and Duncan Kennedy. They were the next owners. They bought it later in the 1840s, and they sold it in 1874. And it had a succession of owners, eventually called, to a syndicate, eventually called the Glenroy Land Company. The Houston Hosking names are mentioned on a few of those blocks there. And you can even see that John Pascoe Faulkner had one of those blocks. He was the first notable resident. So that, I'll leave that there for a moment. Now the Kennedys bought the land and they had both sides. There's a Duncan and a Donald. And they bought the whole lot at the time of Old Sydney Road. Now, Sydney Road was, the first Sydney Road is today Pascoe Road.
Oh.
It was Sydney Road before you had Sydney Road, many years before. And the origin of that is that the goldfields, or the people going north, were travelling via Essendon before they went in the various directions, and they went north, up Pascoe Road. So we've got two Sydney roads, two railway lines, and two creeks. And in the period that the Kennedys owned the place, village communities were being formed around. The Scots built a Scots church. Most of their communities were built around a church, and the Kennedys built a church on their property, and it was became the centre of their lives and their village. And people needed to have somewhere to come together and exchange their produce, their skills, and what they offered communities, and just for social life. Now, the squatters' introduction of sheep, cattle, and horses in the district impacted first on the populations of the kangaroos and emus, which usually grazed gently without affecting the growth of natural vegetation. And it also brought constant conflict with the whites and the Aboriginal people as the stock grazed on the lands that the nutritious plants of the Aborigines relied upon. Edward Parker, who was appointed the protector of the Aborigines, who was appointed to investigate matters in the Glenroy district, perceived that the future for Aborigines was grim, owing to the impact of the squatters on their lands, but his warnings were ignored. Now our first, have I gone past all those things? Yes, I have. Oh, Kennedy's land was sold in 1874. That was the beginning of the Glenroy Land Company, which I'll come to later. That was the first, a poster. Which, now, John Pascoe Faulkner was part of the origins of our Melbourne. He was a businessman and a politician. He was the first notable settler in Glenroy. He bought 2 parcels of land in the 1840s in the Oak Park and Hadfield areas. I pointed out before where he was in Hadfield, but he also bought Oak Park and the areas which included the current Faulkner Cemetery. He lived in a slab hut at first and later built his home, which he called Bellevue Park, part of which still exists today. It's part of a broader somehow I must have touched something. That's the house, and I got that from a poster. It was for sale a few years ago. I don't know whether anybody went to bid what you'd pay for a place like that, but it was after he passed on. It was the mansion was attached to it, but it's there today. Now he lived there between 1840 and 1855, and the name of the suburb or the area that's in was derived from an avenue of oak trees on the property. He didn't call it Oak Park. The next lot of residents called it Oak Park. His property is claimed to be the first farm in the colony, the first orchard, and the first vineyard, making fine wine from Australian grapes that he grew in the Hadfield area. His story is too detailed for me to address, but his marks everywhere in Glenroy. Faulkner died in 1868, and after the death of his wife, who had remarried, Ellen Knight, whose farm adjoined Faulkner's property, became a tenant, and together with Joseph English, purchased Bellevue Park in 1880, and they built the mansion that attached to it. They kept, as it's shown in that previous picture, they kept that piece, but they built this onto it. When you go up there today, it's not easy to find. And I've been there quite a few times because I used to have a fellow Rotarian who lived in the street adjoining it. But if you don't know where you're going, you're not going to find Oak Park Court. But he built on the highest point in Oak Park. Oh, you built for the view, don't you? But what could he see? There was no city skyline to look at in 1840. But anyway, he built it on the highest point, just like the churches in country towns build the church on the highest point, so that everybody around can see it, know where to come on Sunday. Now they constructed this extra piece onto it, and it's still there today. Now the agent selling the house in 2022 described as a classic U-shaped driveway, which you can just see through the gates, not easy, is reminiscent of Toorak or a Kulin type estate. So there's Toorak of the north, 1840. The landmark 22-room Oak Park mansion, established by one of Melbourne's founding, was poised, this is what the agent's saying, is poised to smash the suburb record by millions. I don't know what it means. The 5-bedroom house, classified by the National Trust as a historically significant property, and has jaw-dropping highlights, including marble floors and fireplaces. I should have also included the picture of what it looks like inside. So I apologise. You can look it up. Gold leaf features, stained glass, and perhaps this is the Toorak of the north. Now, A.E. Gibson, who has a real estate place in Glenroy and has been there since 1882, was speaking at an auction in the 1940s, and he said that John Pascoe Faulkner and William McCulloch, who I'll mention in a moment, put Glenroy area on the map when they built mansions for more than 60 years earlier, which he's talking about from 1940. It wasn't formed in Glenroy at the time this was built. Gibson was reported in The Age in 1946 saying that the achievement of great and distinguished people, notable among them John Pascoe Faulkner and William McCulloch and others, who selected them in this locality, and through exceptional wisdom, that the district is about to emerge in 1940. A.E. Gibson thought Glenroy was about to explode, but it still happened. There was a war that came along around 1940, and it didn't happen. Now, Judith Falls in her unpublished A Time to Till mentioned an increase in subdivision in the 1850s, and she mentioned numerous brick and stone buildings. So people are starting to move into the area at around that time. And she said that roads and bridges were under construction due to increasing conveyance of goods to market. She said that organised village life existed and services were supported by the roads and church boards. However, gold came along in 1851 and many left. And the larger landholders, however, they were on the right, they stayed. Now, who came next? And when this property, this Wilbur Rook area, was owned by numerous people, James McIntosh, in the leader in 1873, was reported to own a 650-acre Glenroy farm on the west of Old Sydney Road. Now, I'll go back. I'll go the wrong way. I'll go back. He bought this land over here beside the creek, James McIntosh, and he grazed sheep and grew hay, and he was regarded as the largest producer of hay in Melbourne. I didn't use hay for then, but and at the same time the smallholders had market gardens along the creek. William McCulloch, the other person who moved in, was a stock breeder, and he took the land on this side of the Sydney Road and the railway line, and he bred shorthorn cattle. And his Glenroy shorthorns were regarded as the most aristocratic inbreeding that ever stood on Australian ground. A shorthorn bull, known as the Great Count, was reportedly sold for 600 guineas. 600 guineas in 1870. How much money is that? That's squillions. He had travelled to England to buy stud cattle to ensure a strong breeding program, and it was said that his bulls were better housed than English yeomen or workers. His grandson reported that he had spent $30,000 to buy 17 prize animals in 1878 for his farm here at Glenroy. But the land boom came along, and the Glenroy Land Company syndicates made him an offer he couldn't refuse. They offered him £100 per acre to leave. So he went to Coburg and established his farm down in Coburg. And all of the land in that period, at that time, was eventually bought by the Glenroy Land Company. McCulloch's farm had a bull shed in Midford Street, which later became Glenroy's Public Hall and the first home for Glenroy Primary School, in a bull shed. Now, these farmers and wealthy people weren't the only residents in Glenroy. A number of small landers had established their homes and dairies and farmers. And by 1891, Glenroy had a population of 224 people. Big time. Now, I'm going to get off land for a moment and talk about the railway. Because if we didn't have the railway, we didn't have the next stage in Glenroy's development. Now, while all this was happening, the North East Rail Line was laid through Glenroy, and this is the rail line here, on its way to Wodonga, so you could change trains and all ready to go to Sydney, because we didn't have a standard gauge. And it came in 1872. I was looking at a railway YouTube clip about the early railways. The first railway in Melbourne was the Melbourne to Sandridge, Port Melbourne, about 1853. So nearly 20 years later, there's a train line going through to Sydney. On its way to Albury, and at the time, the only nearby stops were Essendon and Broadmeadows. And the interesting thing about Broadmeadows, it was 2 miles from the Broadmeadows Township. The station wasn't even in the township, because the Broadmeadows Township was Westmeadows. But Westmeadows was on the old Sydney Road. So again, when they've gone up Pascoe Road, they've gone down the Johnson Street Hill if anybody's been down the Johnson Street Hill, and then up Micklin Road before it aligned itself to go to Sydney. Now, interstate and intrastate trains travelled express through Glenroy until 1886, when the Glenroy and Pascoe stations were built, but only at the request of local deputations and a cost to the two communities. They had to pay for their own stations, about £5,000 each. So it needed a local collection or some wealthy people to sponsor it. Although it was hardly an express speed, as the long incline from Pascoe Station, known as the Glenroy Bank, tested many a steam engine. Stephen Carroll, in his books, remarks that almost only Heavy Harry in the 1940s could pull freight trains up the hill. And I was looking at the development of steam engines, and Heavy Harry was a monster. But even it couldn't pull the trains up if there'd been a little bit of drizzle. Steel on steel didn't work. Indeed, the Glenroy Bank was a long-lasting issue for the railways, as even, as I said, Heavy Harry struggled on wet tracks, causing the line to be blocked. So the regular trains, suburban trains, couldn't go up and down while there's a train broken down because its load's too heavy and it can't go anywhere. Then, in the 1920s, 26, it was decided to construct a Glenroy Albion loop. Now, I think I can go through there. I don't need that yet. I've got it somewhere. And it took the trains off it took the heavy trains, the goods trains, off the suburban network because they were causing issues. But it was all because the gradient from Pascoe Vale Station, if you've ever been on a train, it's 1 in 50, and that's a lot for a train. And I wonder how fast that runaway train that just slowly slid out of Broadmeadows some years ago was going when it went down that hill through Pascoe Vale, and they had put old carriages on the line so that would run into them to buffer it, to slow it down so it wouldn't knock over what is Southern Cross Station today. I wonder how fast it is going. But the idea that this decision to build this Albion loop, which goes over the Trestle Bridge, which you know from Strathmore. Yes. Tom knows it because it's behind his place. It met with objections. The only way they could, it was all to bypass Glenroy, and if you've ever followed that line, it joins up at Broadmeadows. There's an extra line there. But the people objected to it because it was going to split the town. And there is a part in Glenroy where it's split by the railway line. And the only way to get across to a part of Glenroy, a small portion of Glenroy West, but a little bit north, is via Bel Air Avenue. You might sneak out through Jacana, but Bel Air Avenue is the only access for a lot of people. And they were objecting that this Glenroy, this Sunshine Albion loop was going to split the town. And it has. Now the new line required a building of what today is known as the Trestle Bridge over the Mooney Ponds Creek. It's deeper than the Sydney Harbour Bridge is high. It's deeper than the Harbour Bridge is high. So if you turn the Harbour Bridge upside down, it wouldn't be as big as our loop. First, the goods trains were diverted to the new route to avoid the Glenroy Ram, and eventually the spirit of progress against the wishes of the Minister, who said that such trains use the suburban system. The deputation of Broadmeadows and Glenroy and Pascoe Vale to the Royal Commissioners in 1887, once they'd got a line there and stopping at these places, wanted the service to have put on more trains, asking for 3 extra trains both morning and afternoon, and to meet the requirements of people a letter in the Argus in 1927 even requested special trains on Saturdays to enable people to attend the theatres and for the northern golfers to return after their day on the course. Because most of the people who played golf at Northern didn't come from Glenroy, but more like Essendon, because their links with the original golf club was still there. In 1888, a travelling contributor, who was a travel writer, took a train trip to Glenroy, and writing in the Age described Glenroy as the #1 beauty spot in Melbourne. There we are. There's a Toorak of the North. Keeps coming back. He said that Glenroy would become a fashionable and popular suburb, and he was particularly entranced by the train journey, which he described as more interesting than a trip to Brighton. Glenroy was now on the map. I'm not sure there was an article about the #2 beauty spot, so that was the only one ever written. He spoke of the prosaic landscape around Newmarket, the panorama of cosy cottages, snug farmhouses, palatial mansions, surrounded by copse and hedge, and the varied breaks of hill and dale and the belts of indigenous timber. Is that the train line that I go on? Well, I've become a little bit more observant, and I've noticed that because that line has a road on this side and a road on that side that runs in parallel, you see the fronts of houses.
Yes.
You go over to the eastern suburbs and you see the backs of houses. You look into people's backyards, and the backyard isn't as attractive as the front. So his cosy cottages are there, and I look at them every time, and I just love them. The little section from Kensington, Newmarket to Ascot Bay. After that, it's just suburban again. But those old cottages are beautiful. Now, was he paid by the Glenroy Land Company? Because it was certainly in the period when the land sales were being advertised. He said that the 25-minute journey from Spencer Street had much to offer the pleasure seeker. Who knows? The pleasure of the trip is enhanced by the roads following the line. So he's looking at the roads and the houses in those roads. And the fact that the traveller is able to see the fronts of houses, not back gardens, as is the case in many other suburban lines. And he said that. So the railways was important, and Glenroy got a station by 1886, and it was able then to promote its land sales. Now, the service to Glenroy and Broadmeadows was only a shuttle service until 1925. Electrification had reached Essendon in 1921, and it was still to come for the rest of them. Businessmen made good use of the service and were able to travel to the city and points both nearby and beyond, and indeed many business people had taken up residence in Glenroy quite close to the station. So people were moving in, business people. A good siding was had in 1908, and I'll talk about the mill later, and extended into the flour mill in 1950, and a section of the siding, even though the mill's gone, is still there. An automatic substation was built in 1922 to bring more power to the line, so that when the electric trains came, there was enough electrical power that they could climb that Glenroy ramp. It was noted in a letter to the editor in the Argus in 1935 that a regular train user complained about increasing fares on the train. He said that 30 years ago he could travel first class return for $1. But now, after electrification, the return second class fare was £1 and 2 halfpenny. He's now travelling second class. He said, "Is it any wonder that working people can't afford to live in the open spaces?" And we all complain when fares down. Today, the sprinter trains from various country points along the line race through Glenroy, and the XPT to Sydney, which is Spirit of Progress, Southern Aurora, XPT, now uses that Glenroy Albion loop, and we don't see it.
see Broadman's the platform 3 and had gone past it,
Yes, yes. I looked at the video clip of Broadman Station after dark. Not that it's safe to go there after dark. Broadie's all right, those stations. Broadie's all right, those stations. But it showed the number of goods trains that come through Broadmeadow Station through the night. To get even, some of them are 100 trucks long going through that station. It's amazing. Anyway, at Glenroy we've got a new station. I mentioned it's underneath. I haven't been there yet, but so there's only 10 or 15 minute wait to cross the railway line as it used to be. Because in the mornings you could strike the regular suburban trains and then there'd be a sprinter train come through. And you could be there and not go anywhere for ages. Now back to the Glenroy Land Company. Now the Glenroy Land Company was formed by a group of 4 people, but I'm sure there are others who became involved. There was Frank Stewart, John McCutcheon, Arthur and Albert Wiseman, so there's 2 from one family. And there's no date for the formation of the company, but I've got thoughts that there might have been. But clearly this group had a vision for the future. Now these 4 people had money. They were wealthy. Frank Stewart, I'm going to talk about in a moment, and the Wisemans, but I know nothing about McCutcheon other than he was a city banker. Now, they had their vision for the future. They wanted it to become a place with a number of mansions and wealthy homes, just like the luxury they were enjoying, to attract others to come. It was to be the Toorak of the North. They and others had built their own homes in the area and built 3 shops in Wheatsheaf Road for a butcher, a baker, and it wasn't a candlestick maker, it was a general store. They converted a stable in Whitford Street into a public hall and formed the roads. They paid the government to provide the railway station and negotiate a regular train service. By 1887 there were 9 trains a day. They invested heavily into the infrastructure in the area. A number of the homes built by the Glenroy Land Company syndicate remain today, but sadly many haven't survived and some are in various stages of disrepair. Now they got into promoting Glenroy. First, in 1887, their first subdivisions that they'd offered, they called it the Highlands of Melbourne. They hadn't thought of Toorak of the North at this stage. They promoted it. And this is Wheatsheaf Road here. And they had it all planned out, and it was going to be the centre of Glenroy, Wheatsheaf Road. That was their first one. They offered free travel. You could buy a house for a block of land for £5 deposit. Then they came again. I don't know how well they did. Now they've called it Glenroy number 2, the Toorak of the North. The first to use this name. Now this picture, this plan, is featured in this lovely book by students of Hatfield High School. This plan is that map. Now, when I look at this map, they put Frank Stewart's house on. He was here. They made the plan. He's put his name there. The Wisemans have put their names up there on their houses, and there was a third one up there, which is called Hilton, which was the McCutcheon's house. And they planned to sell these properties. They put down sold. But I don't believe they sold any. But if you put it there, people are going there. It's a con. It's a con. We'll get people interested. Anyway, so that was their second plan on the 3rd of March in 1888. Then they came again. Well, this is before the drilling out of water. But they were promoting the other side of the railway line. And in here, it has Sydney Road. They were still calling it Sydney Road. 5% deposit, balance quarterly up to 3 years at 3% interest. You can't get that interest rate these days, can you?
No.
And the 3rd of March, and another one on the 10th of March. Each promoting a different part of Glenroy. They've got the station, and they're up north of the station on the east side. That was their promotions. Now, I've been trying to work out whether they were successful or not. Now, a number of the houses that were built in this period, and it's a list, have survived today, covered by heritage overlay. Now, I've got some pictures of some. Where am I going? I'll come back to that. I'll talk about Frank Stewart, and then I'll show you the houses. Toorak in Salisbury Street used to be owned by the Wiseman family. It was only sold for the first time after 135 years of continuous ownership during lockdown. Someone bought it. Frank Stewart's house, Allenbrae, is part of Craig Care Nursing Home in Plumpton Avenue, and Wiseman House still stands. I'll show you them soon. Now, the land company laid out the current street pattern, and it focused on Wheatsheaf Road. It was marketed, first of all, in 1887, offering sale as the Highlands of Melbourne. They provided free railway passes, free lunch, and a picnic on the grounds. The poster promoted picturesque and panoramic view, bracing air, and virgin soil. They didn't say anything about the clay that you've got in your backyard. The second land sale in 1888 was the first that used the Toorak of the North, and they were noted as residential subdivisions in Broadmeadow's southern areas. In 1891, Glenroy, which settled close to the railway line on the east side, had a population of 224 people. Not much had changed as a result of the land sales. There were 220 people before it started and 220 after the land was sold. Nobody came. The Broadmeadows Observer suggests that the Glenroy Land Company was ahead of its time. Another report said the Yarra and Gardner Creeks over Toorak Lane were more attractive. Although the trains were packed with people who came for a look. You've got to have a squiz, free trip, have a day out. You might buy something, you might not. The land boom was happening across Melbourne, and it appears that these speculators had misjudged the market for the Glenroy areas. The auctioneers claimed that all the quarter-acre blocks were sold, but in reality only a few plots were taken up, and by 1890 life went on as normal. Nothing happened. The Glenroy Land Company was wound up in 1891. Frank Stewart and John McCutcheon sold their shares back to the company, the Glenroy Land and Savings Company, and Wiseman cut his losses by selling his properties to his wife and children. So they weren't his now. However, Wiseman's business in the city went bust during the 1890s depression. The mansions that had been built were mostly left standing in paddocks, and many were demolished after they'd fallen into disrepair. Now, I'll try and tell you about the people and show you a bit more. I think there's a few of these out of sequence with what I'm saying. I'll talk about Frank Stewart. Frank Stewart, and I've studied Frank Stewart because he was the president of Essendon Golf Club. He was born in Penrith in New South Wales in 1834. His parents were farm estate managers, and he started work with the Sydney draper at age 13. He came to Melbourne in 1866 with a degree of urgency. He eloped with Matilda Coulter, the 19-year-old daughter of his employer. She was pregnant. They married hastily in Sydney and jumped onto a ship to Melbourne, where the first of their three sons, Frank Jr., was born on the 4th of June in 1886. Now, because of the stigma of children born out of wedlock and the impact of families' reputations, the birth notice in the Sydney Mail was delayed until December, when their son was already 6 months old. It was all hushed. Anyway, Frank started work in the Collins Street with a Collins Street mercer, and he worked his way up and soon owned the business. He became the proprietor of Lincoln, Stewart and Company, a prosperous business that supplied uniforms, first of all, to the New South Wales Sudan contingent. He later saw opportunities for the manufacture of waterproof clothing before being taken over by Dunlop, who saw some money in it. He was president of the Victorian Chamber of Manufacturers and was elected to the Legislative Council Assembly in East Melbourne in 1889, when his abilities were so quickly recognised that he was included in the Munro Ministry as a member of Cabinet without portfolio. He was just too good to leave outside. In April 1891, he resigned. He used his commercial talent and developed refined literary taste and was a keen reader. He was one of the founders of the Beefsteak Club, one of Melbourne's clubs, these exclusive clubs, and ranked amongst its most genial and popular members of the time, and he gained a liberal education as an after-dinner speaker. He was re-elected to Parliament for North Melbourne in 1904 and served till 1907. Now, Frank lived in Plumpton Avenue, his house, Allenbury, and he built the house, he built outbuilding, a tennis court, a small dairy and piggery for the household, and an orchard and a large vegetable garden. He played the host on weekends and encouraged his sons to arrange gatherings for dances and tennis. He became the managing director of the Carbine Cycle and Motor Company and drove a 2-cylinder Swift in the first Sydney to Melbourne reliability trial, but only made it to Gundagai. Perhaps the land company might have been arranged on some of those weekends. I wonder. Now, the other people involved were the Wisemans, who grew up in Whitford in Hertfordshire. That's how we get Whitford Street. Eddie McGuire came from Whitford Street, but he was at the top end. Now, they set up business in Flinders Lane, and they were in the business of dealing with woolen goods and tailors' trimmings, whatever that is. And they built 2 imposing houses in Glenroy. Oh, there's Frank Stewart, is the guy on the left in the picture. He's with Kulin McCracken in the middle, and Kulin McCracken was part of the McCracken brewery firm from Essendon that made lots of money, and he built Lowther Hall as his home, which he called Earlsbury Hall. And that was called McCracken in the middle. The other guy was Milne, he was the secretary of the golf club. This is part of Wheatsheaf Road in the time when they built the shops in the 1880s. And this lean-to building with this roof this side was the first Glenroy post office. There's Wiseman House. Has anybody been to see Wiseman House in Whitford Street? It's got quite a story. And I'll tell that in a moment. The Wisemans I was going to talk about, they were related to people of vice-regal extraction in England in the 1500s. They weren't related to the royal family, but they were part of nobility. And they came out here and they liked to live in the style of the wealthy landowners of the people at the time. It sort of replicate what people were doing in England. The wise ones liked to make money. They always saw an opportunity to make money, but they were philanthropists at the same time and took care of orphan boys and girls. And they donated a lot of money to help poor people. Now, each year, Melbourne Cup time, they dressed themselves to the nines. All their footmen and their coachmen and their people, and they went to the races. They went to Flemington. And the local people looked forward each year. It was a spectacle of the Wiseman's family driving off in carriages and footmen and grooms to the Melbourne Cup along Old Sydney Road. And they had hopes, as part of their involvement in the Glenroy Land Company, of attracting people who liked to live like they did. There's another photo of the same building. I forget what the name of the little turret thing at the top, but it has its origins. Sorry?
Widow's Walk.
Yeah, that's right. But it has its origins in seafaring communities where the widows or the wives would stand up at the top and hope that the ship was coming in.
Yeah.
And they built that on their place. Not that they weren't travelling by ship. But Wiseman House, during the First World War, became a military hospital. Now, there were two buildings exactly the same. The two Wisemans built buildings exactly the same as each other. Huge buildings. One was called Sawbridgeworth, and the other was called Ashley. And they became military hospitals during the First World War. One for the ranked people, the officers and the gentlemen, officers, and the other one was for the regular soldiers. Wiseman House was also used as a girls' home for a long time, and they were orphaned girls in there. Now, Wiseman House was bought by St Matthew's Church, and the highlight was Johnny Farnham got married there in 1973. So I thought that was interesting. Anyway, who was the mastermind behind it all? I think that Frank Stewart was the mastermind. He'd already been involved in land deals in Hawthorne and in Gippsland, so he already had experience. He had connections through his Chamber of Manufacturers and his role in politics. I'm sure he was the one who conned the guy to write these lovely words about Glenroy being the #1 beauty spot in hard to imagine, isn't it? But why did it fail? Why did it fail? Perhaps other areas were more attractive, had easier access to the city. It was too soon for Glenroy, as the Observer noted. The rail service was limited. There was no reticulated water. The nearest shopping centre was Essendon, and the nearest pub was at Old Broadmeadows. And there was no school. So perhaps where it looked good, it didn't have the things that people need for everyday existence. Anyway, I think I've got some pictures of some of the homes. Oh, there was another attempt at selling homes in 1908 later. Oh, these are hand-drawn maps, pictures by the way, by Andrew Lemon from his book, Broadmeadows of Forgotten History. They tried the Tiverton estate, and that was another of its subdivisions, and this is 1915, 1916, but there's a war on it. I don't know if there was money around. I don't think the men were there to come and have a look at the places. They claim they sold 34 of 71 of the places on offer, but again, not very much happened. Now this is the home that was built by the Wisemans called Toorak in Salisbury Street. It's a beautiful home. And even the palm tree is classified. So that's the best of the Wisemans places. These are old places that still exist today. Gowrie Park House in Gowrie Street in Glenroy. Greystones in Bel Air Avenue. There's a Glen Lynn that's now become a part of the nursing home. It's been tacked onto it. This house in Tudor Street, this is a magnificent little place. It's right near the railway line. It was built for the assistant station master. I don't know what the station master was. Yeah, I took that photo just a couple of weeks ago. So that's what it's like. Lovely. All defined by the chimney. It's a period thing. One of our Rotarians, Sal Pearson, Pearson's lawyers in Glenroy, he lived there. I don't know what the name of that place was in its original form. This one, I had its name, but I can't remember it. It's just near the new library in Glenroy, across the road, Acacia Street. It's been hidden from public view, basically by the hedge, but I sneaked up the driveway to get it. Well, you have to when you're doing these things. And this is in Glenroy Road. And these are lovely places that have been classified by the National Trust. Now this is Frank Stewart's house, Alan Bray, and behind it is Craig Care home. And that was his place. And you know, you just got to go and walk into it. You can walk into there. It's beautiful. Now, when they built all these places, and this James Chapman, who comes, this was one of the shops in its original form. I wonder when they built all these mansions, where did all the tradies come from? You know, all the people who built them. You know, they just... And when you look at the buildings that they built then, many of them, they still stand strongly today. But where did the people come from? How did they get the materials then? There was a train, of course, but it still requires skills of workers to make these buildings as they are today, and they're still standing. I just wonder where they all came from. I'm going to talk about the guy on the right afterwards. He was there before, that's A.E. Gibson. He was there before the Glenroy Lane Company. He was already selling properties in the area in 1882, 6 years before the Glenroy Lane Company. He didn't have an office there. He did all his business at Scott's Hotel in Collins Street, next to Spencer Street Station, as many did. Many auctions were held in Scott's Hotel. And he didn't build his office until 1952. This was his house, A. Gibson. And it's gone. It's gone. Waverley. Now that's his talking about his business that he's done and what he's been involved in. He's been involved in so many things, and actually I would think that the Glenroy Land Company were there for the quid. They were going to make a quick quid out of selling all these places. They put a lot of money into it, and they're hoping to get their money back and more. But A. Gibson has been there for the long run, and his business is still there. He's now into a fourth generation, Peter Gibson, who I know well. He still occupies their office in Glenroy, and is proud of their company. They claim to be the longest family-owned business still in operation in Victoria. This is Arcadia, built by Chapman. And James Chapman built 6 mansions in in a small area up the top in Glenroy West area. He built 6, and none of them are left. And because he built all these places, they renamed the street. It was Glenroy Street originally. They renamed it Chapman Avenue.
Yeah.
And who lives in Chapman Avenue?
Yeah.
Yes. This was Hilton, the home of John McCutcheon, would have been up near Hilton Street. Who have got the name? It doesn't exist anymore. Aren't they beautiful places? It's all because, I think partly because nobody came. They were just left to fall into disrepair. Nobody wanted them. And as the observer said, they were probably ahead of their time. Oh, the railway station. Glenroy, but this train was the shuttle service from Essendon to Glenroy and back again, or Essendon to Broadmeadows and back again. The Rowan diesel. As I mentioned earlier about the Glenroy Road, they needed really powerful engines to pull their trucks up that steep incline. There's Heavy Harry. He couldn't do it either. And then the Spirit of Progress first of all came along in 1939. This is, it's hard to see, but it's the railway line. You can see at the bottom part of the map, looking across the railway line into Glenroy West in the 1950s. There isn't much there. There's the substation that gave the extra power. And there's the trestle bridge. Now, I really want to talk, I don't know how much time I've got. Some people have walked out. I was going to talk about school. Well, I think I'll forget the school. Do you want to know about the school? You might have questions about 12 next. My file has 9,000 words that I've written about this. Putting all this together. In 1891, the population of Glenroy was 224. It's gone up. I think I said 221 before. And it was that time that Glenroy State School number 3118 was opened. Now, a request had been made in November in 1890 by J.S. Milford, James Stanley Milford, on behalf of a committee of residents, which included the Wisemans and Frank Stewart. Glenroy State School opened in a leased building on the 6th of April 1891 with Mr. Clarkson as the head teacher. It was a lease by 1903, the leased building which had been a stable, full shed, whatever it was. It was owned by I can't think of his name, I've gone through so many names. It was considered smoky, had a smoky fireplace, was damp, drafty, cold in winter, and had an overhead tarpaulin which gathered dust. It wasn't sealed in. Anyway, James Stanley Milford was an American. He was the son of the United States ambassador to Brazil, where James spent his early childhood years. He studied at Cornell University and in the early 1980s was sent to Adelaide to manage the Singer operation. Sewing machines, perhaps. He married a Melbourne lady and they moved, because you've got to go where the lady is, so he didn't have he wasn't attached to any place. They came to Melbourne and they lived in Wheatsheaf Road, right next to where the school is today. They later built a house in Melbourne Avenue, which he called Saranac. Now, Saranac was a lake near where he lived, where he grew up in New York State. He had a keen interest in baseball and became known as the father of baseball in Victoria. And as a fisherman, his submissions led to the establishment of the Fisheries Commission to control fishing in Victoria. Anyway, that's about him. Now, the Wheatsheaf Road site was purchased in 1906 and a new wooden building was opened in April 1908, and Miss Bridget Shortell was the first head teacher of the school with 53 pupils. But she wasn't provided with a table and a chair. She had to stand all day. So she wrote a letter of complaint. I don't know how quickly it was responded to, and I don't know how tired her feet would have been at the end of the day. Now, her name is remembered in the reserve next to the new library. It's called the Bridget Shortell Reserve. But no one will ever know who she was until someone puts a plaque there. It needs some recognition that she was first. I'd hate to have something forgotten that I'd done, or anybody had done, not remembered into the future. Anyway, as the school grew as the suburb grew. By 1938, there were 198 pupils in the brick building, which had been constructed in 1927, but the area was still one of small farms and vacant allotments. In 1950, after the war, the enrolment was 286. By 1956, it had increased to 1,350. Now, the influx of the new pupils was due to the large number of post-war immigrant families and former residents of Campbell settling in the district in the housing commissions to the north of Glenroy. But at one stage, the school, I've copied the cartoon, I've got to go past a few of these things. There's the Glenroy Railway crossing way back in the 1950s. If people want to have a look at these later, you can go through them, and I'll send Melvin, I'll send you a copy of all of this. The railway crossing, which caused grief, had people waiting. There's the school, and it's still, that part's still there, and it's been incorporated into the library. And when you go into the building, there's a delightful little small reading section in there. I think it's more a children's section.
It's also a recording studio.
Is it? It's quite appropriate, isn't it? It's well done. Well done. There's the school. Someone's put the school in 1917 and painted the shelter shed. And there's Bridget Shortell Reserve. And I'd love them to put a plaque there to recognise her. Now, there's a cartoon from the newspaper in the Herald in June 1954. The Glenroy School had 626 pupils in the school at the time, but it was only built to hold 450. They were 3 to a desk, and the principal said he couldn't get in the front door. He wasn't Santa Claus. It's the only way I can get into the classroom. It's going down through the wing. But that's a cartoon of 1954. I think it's brilliant. Now, the children from all of these new homes had to go to school somewhere. And at the time, Glenroy was the only primary school. Late in 1956, Broadmeadow South, later known as Glenroy North, was open to keep up with the demand for places. At one stage in 1954, this is what I've just said, it was reported that a school for 450 had 620 students in 9 rooms, 3 to a desk, and up to 90 in a classroom.
Wow.
Could you handle that? The demand for secondary, technical and high schools followed. Glenroy High opened in 1954, the Tech School in 56, and not before the Federation of Mothers Club has described the situation in the local schools as a disgrace, as many had to be bused to nearby schools and even to the showgrounds to go to school. By the 1960s, Glenroy was overcoming its teething problems. Schools were built alongside housing developments, but these were very basic and poorly equipped, and it took until the Whitlam years before disadvantage was addressed through the Disadvantaged Schools program. Were you involved in that? Yes, we had to make submissions. And it was clearly understood and known that this Glenroy North into Broadmeadows area was the most disadvantaged area in Australia. They received the highest level of disadvantaged schools program support of all, and Glenroy North was #1 for a time. I could go on. I've got more about...
I think we've got to make it, yeah, number 2 for that second.
It's 9:35. I've done my 50 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Anyway, I'll just finish off the schools. As the population of Glenroy has aged, we're old people now in Glenroy, all our kids have moved on. Many of the schools that were built in those boom years have closed. They've been amalgamated. Glenroy's gone, Glenroy North's gone, they've become Glenroy Central. And the lands have been redeveloped for housing. Glenroy College serves the need for secondary education, although its standards have been a topic of some recent discussion. But primary education is well catered for at Glenroy Central, Glenroy West and Bellevue Park, which was the old Gowrie Park. But, yeah, I was going to talk about the land boom, talk about the disgrace of that, Northern Northcote, but I'll give you all my notes, and if you like to put them on a circular for your members, you're most welcome. Anyway, thank you very much. Ready for questions? None? I've covered them. I'll help you. Yes.
Yes.
Tom?
I've got a comment, Michael. Firstly, I should explain. My older daughter had the good fortune to have Michael as her teacher in grade 5 at primary school. But my connection to Glenroy is that my maternal grandfather, had a farm in Glenroy, as it was known then, which is on that map that Michael's shown us, has become part of Hatfield. And my mother grew up there and she went to that school. She was born in 1913. Their name was Reddish, and the Reddish Reserve behind the East Street shops is named after my great-grandfather, who was, from what I can gather, was Shire President of Broadmeadows in 1912. But the other little story I was going to tell you was that they had the farmhouse was in Middle Street, about opposite David Street now, and the farm itself was 30 acres along North Street, starting at East Street, and he also farmed 10 acres down East Street, down to Middle Street, which was owned by another member of the family. But my grandfather hosted Toorak games in the farm. There was a big circle of box lawns in the farm area, and there was an organised Toorak game, I think almost every weekend. I can remember going up there as a kid and seeing this going on, and the story goes that he used to sit in the windmill plucking chooks, and he was acting as the cockatoo or the lookout for the police were coming. That's my association with Glenroy, but my grandfather died in 1947, and the 30 acres was then sold up, and Sutherland Street is in part of it, and you might be interested to know that on the corner of Middle Street and West Street, where there's now shops, there was a water hole, and as kids we used to go yamming in that, and then it became a Caltex service station, and now there's shops on it.
And the Caltex service station was run by Ron Cox. Ron Cox was the father, well, he was a Rotarian at Rotary Club of Broadmeadows, which meets in Moreland, because we got this identity crisis when they put a ring road and changed the suburbs. Yes, and I bought petrol there.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, my association goes back to 1970. We moved in May 1970, even though I was at Greenvale in 69 and used Glenroy as our shopping centre. We actually moved in to Hadfield at that time.
I had my first driving lesson in a 5-ton truck in East Street, about where the shops are now, and East Street wasn't made, and that would have been 1956, 57.
Yeah, and the roads in Hadfield weren't completely made until 1968. And there's quite a story about people going to work, walking in their gumboots, leaving their gumboots at the station, putting their shoes on. And is that a Coburg thing too?
Yes.
Yes.
Michael, can I just elaborate on the question? But when you were mentioning Glenroy, we were the people that visited Glenroy in South Australia. So we went near Penola in South Australia, and we were reading a plaque about the Cameron brothers and so forth, and then we discovered this sign that said Glenroy, so we went and explored. So the Camerons settled there. Now, I may be wrong, but I think Mary McKillop was the sister-in-law or something, and she was teaching.
Well, the school in Broadmeadows is Penola.
That's the connection. And so when as we were reading this, we realised the other brother came over here to Port Phillip, and he settled in Glenroy. Penola Secondary College is the link. And we have friends in Roxburgh Park that live in Donald Cameron Drive. So it all sort of started to make sense to us.
And William Brunton,
Yeah.
who's somebody else, William Brunton, who was invited to be a patron of Northern Golf Club by Kulin Nation, who lived in that place. His property was Roxburgh Park, and now it's the suburb. So it's a small world, and some of those things are a bit circular with the Penola Glenroy connection, because it's here.
Yes. And we grew up in Glenroy.
Yeah. I'll just go through a few more pictures. This is the home. This is Lowther Hall, by the way, today. It was the home of Kulin Nation. His company, he was a brewer. His company was taken over by Carlton United. They went bust because they spent a lot of money on electrifying the railway to Essendon. He had to move. The house was bought by Edwin Coles from Coles' Funny Book Arcade. He turned it into a zoo. They had monkeys and animals around in the place. He died. Actually, he advertised for a wife first. He died, and the Anglican Church bought it, and they named it after the bishop or the archbishop. He was Edward Lowther something, and they gave it Lowther Hall, which was his, must have been a family name that's gone through, and that became Lowther Hall. Essendon had to move, the golf club had to move to the Cross Keys, and within almost weeks they built a clubhouse. That was the members. They had to move because the Melbourne Cemetery Trust thought in 1903 a good place for the Melbourne General Cemetery. They had an option on the land, so they had to move, and they eventually finished up in Buckley Park before they came to Glenroy. But the Melbourne General Cemetery wasn't built there, opened there. It was 1906 up here in part of Hatfield. Yeah. So there's our clubhouse. Some of the aerial shots give you a picture of how Glenroy set up. That's about 1948. Let's look at the people and places in the distance. In 1961, and that circle around the football ground, which is still reserved, was a bike track. They had cycling races at half time or before the game. But that's 1961, so it didn't take long to fill up. Anyway, I've got 125, I'm up to 72.
I wanted to have some thank yous. I've got to thank Janine, who isn't here from the library. She set up the room, and I hope you'll help us clear the chairs. You just stack them around the walls, and she set it all up. She set up the IT. She did the publicity, and a lot of you are here because of Janine's effort. So thank you to her. Want to also thank Julie Hogan, who does so much. She was on the desk. She'll be doing the refreshments that you have after, so I hope you'll stop and have a few chats and have some biscuits and something to drink if you've got time. And also, I suppose I should to remind you that we're selling the wine and the advertisements are on the table, and we've got the shopping bags. And the last but not least, I'd like to thank Michael for his huge topic. I think we should have broken it down to about three bits. But anyway, thank you very much, Michael. I'm sure you've got lots to...
I enjoyed that.
Yeah, right. You might write us something that's a bit like 1,000 words. Maybe a few thousand each one. Different topics. Yeah.
I said my file was about 9,000 words.
Yeah.
But I keep finding things and adding things. I didn't get round to the aerodrome. Where Glenroy High School was Glenroy Aerodrome.
Yeah. We could have one on that.
Well, that only lasted 4 years.
It was very proud. Anyway, this is for you, and we hope you liked it. It's to remember coming to Coburg Historical Society to talk tonight. So I want to thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd like to say I've lost a bit of sleep over this, but I'm okay. I think I was about 4 months ago, didn't I?
Yeah, a long time ago.